Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian true crime cases and today we are covering another solved case. So let's just get straight into the case of Virginia Morse. In November of 1973, Brian and Virginia Morse were a married couple that lived on a rural property in the quiet town of Collarenebri, New South Wales, with their 3 children. 35-year-old Virginia Morse, described as a country girl at heart, was born Virginia Hook, known as Jenny to friends and family. She met her husband Brian Morse in the 1950s and he proposed when Virginia was just 20 years old. The pair married in 1959, days before Virginia turned 21 years old, and they moved in to Brian's family's property near the town of Collarenebri. It wasn't long before they moved into the homestead that they would eventually raise their family in. Soon the couple were pregnant and had a baby girl named Eloise. A few years later they had a son named Adrian, and their final child, born in 1968, was a son named Robbie. As well as raising 3 children and running the family household, Virginia Morse was very involved in her local community, joining the Red Cross and the Country Women's Association. If there was any kind of community event taking place, Virginia could be counted on to take part or lend a helping hand. She loved being involved in her local community. For a living, Brian Morse worked in agriculture, including ploughing and harvesting, and he actually hired seasonal workers to work on the Morse's family property. One of these casual labourers was named Alan Baker. In 1972, Alan Baker spent several months working on the Morse's family property, as well as eating meals with the Morse family and playing with the Morse's 3 young children. You see, Virginia was such a kind, caring, giving and just a kind-hearted person that she would look after these seasonal labourers that worked on her family property, even though she had absolutely no obligation to do so. So just remember the name Alan Baker because that will come up again in just a minute. On November the 6th, Virginia Morse was home alone, which was completely normal. Her husband had taken the 3 children to catch the school bus that morning, and then he had gone into the town of Morse to attend to some business or some work. Unbeknownst to Brian and Virginia, their house had actually been staked out by a pair of career criminals for the last 2 days. The criminals had been lurking on the outskirts of the family's property, and their names were Kevin Crump and Alan Baker. The same Alan Baker that had been a casual labourer for several months at the Morse's family property. Baker and Crump, both in their mid-20s, were convicted criminals that met in prison and became friends. Their crimes up until this point included things such as thefts, break-and-enters, and armed hold-ups. During their time in prison, Crump and Baker's friendship developed into more than a friendship, if you get my drift. So a little about the pair. Alan Baker was ex-Army Reserve, having joined in the 1960s, where he developed a love for guns, particularly rifles. Kevin Crump, on the other hand, who was illiterate, was described as slow and easily led by others, hence why he fell into a life of crime. When Alan Baker was released from prison, he began living and working on a rural farm in New South Wales. One day, his ex-prison buddy, Kevin Crump, came to visit him in a stolen car, pretty much out of the blue. The pair actually worked together on the farm for a period of time before the rainy season, I suppose, brought a temporary end to any work they had there. This break from farm work led the pair into planning somewhat of a road trip together. They didn't actually have a permanent place of residence as they had been camping out on the farm. So they basically loaded all their things into the stolen vehicle of Kevin Crump's and headed off. They started their road trip by heading towards the town of Goondiwindi, and they arrived there in early November of 1973. Here, the pair buy a .308 rifle, ammo, and 2 balaclavas, intent of continuing their life of crime together. So back to November the 6th, the pair were staking out the Morse's homestead. Baker and Crump, who had been hiding behind a large haystack on the Morse's family property and had been armed with a rifle, had seen Brian and the children leave that morning, which meant Virginia Morse was home alone. And just to add in here that Alan Baker was aware that this was the home he had spent several months working at. I think it'll be pretty hard to forget that, but just in case you were wondering. So when they saw Brian and the children leave, they took this as their chance to enter the family's property and threatened Virginia Morse with their rifle, telling her to do what they said. From there, they bound, blindfolded and gagged Virginia, loaded her into their stolen vehicle and began driving towards Queensland, taking predominantly back roads to get there as to not be caught out, particularly as they were in a stolen vehicle. But now they were in a stolen vehicle with an abducted woman. The only thing the pair stole from the Morse's family property was $30 and some of their rifles, the Morse's rifles. Along the way, the pair made several stops, mostly for beer and petrol. All the while, Virginia was begging and pleading for her life, but to no avail. The trio eventually stopped south of the Queensland border, where they drove down a remote sidetrack, parked, and dragged Virginia Morse from their vehicle. From there, they tied Virginia Morse up. They tied her hands behind her back to a tree, if that makes sense, and they tied each of her legs to two separate trees. So she was lying like horizontally, or tied up horizontally. Virginia, who was still gagged and blindfolded, was then sexually assaulted by both Crump and Baker. Virginia continued to cry and beg to be released, but in the remoteness of the bush, nobody but her captors could hear her pleas for her life. They then untied Virginia and threw her back into the stolen vehicle before continuing on their journey. After this, Crump and Baker pulled over their vehicle to rest for the night. Back in Collarenebri, Virginia's children, Adrian and Robbie, got off the school bus to wait for their mother. So the boys' school was on one side of a river and the Morse's family property was on another side of a river, so Virginia would often row across to collect her two boys. But the boys waited for an hour and there was no sign of their mother in the rowboat. Adrian eventually swam across the river, collected the rowboat and rowed back across to get his little brother, before rowing back home. At around 7 p.m, Brian Morse, who is still out, rings the family home and Adrian answers. Adrian tells his father that their mother wasn't there to pick them up after school and she's still not home. At first, Brian isn't too concerned, thinking that maybe Virginia went out to visit a friend and lost track of time. Particularly as her car was missing, it seemed likely that she had gone out off her own accord. However, it had not been Virginia that had taken her car out. Baker and Crump had actually drove Virginia's car to an abandoned police station nearby to their homestead at the same time as they were abducting Virginia. At around 9:30 p.m, Brian's becoming concerned, and by this time he is home, so he begins ringing around to friends and family to see if they have seen Virginia or know where she may be. And it's at this point he notices that 3 of his rifles are missing. Virginia's car is eventually located at the abandoned police station, and both Brian and the police believe that Virginia Morse has been abducted. 22 hours after her abduction, Kevin Crump and Alan Baker make their final stop with Virginia Morse, driving down a disused sidetrack that led to the Ware River, near the town of Moonee, Queensland. It is early in the morning. A sleep-deprived Virginia is once again dragged from the car, tied up as she was before, and sexually assaulted by both men. Exactly what happened to Virginia Morse at the Ware River is unknown, as the details of this case were suppressed due to the distressing details of what happened to her. At this point, Virginia is still blindfolded and gagged. She is then untied as both men grab a gun and aim at Virginia, who is lying on the ground. It is Kevin Crump who fires the fatal shot. Virginia is shot between the eyes, execution style. The two men then roll her body into the nearby river and cover it in branches and rocks before burning her clothes in an effort to destroy any evidence. They then drive back to the farm campsite in New South Wales, where the pair originally met up post-prison. In the meantime, police are trying everything they can to locate Virginia Morse, but they're not having any luck. They've really got no leads, no motive, no witnesses, and no idea who would take her and why, and where they would take her. The search intensified as the days passed, with additional resources being brought in to the small town from Sydney. Locals even pitched in with the search, and farmers used their small aircrafts to search the local area. Virginia's disappearance soon reaches national headlines, with her image and appeals for information being placed across radio and television. Police had also interviewed a number of people, including about half the town of Collarenebri, and of course Brian Morse. Although Brian Morse isn't a suspect, police are just trying to identify anyone that may have had an issue with the Morse family or with Brian and may have been seeking some kind of revenge. As Brian is trying to think of anyone that may have had a motive to kill his family, he gives police a list of all the casual labourers that have worked on his family's property in the past. One of the names he mentions is Alan Baker. And with Alan Baker's criminal history, he soon becomes a person of interest. Several witnesses actually claimed to have seen Alan Baker in the area around the time Virginia Morse disappeared, so police make his name and face public, but only as a person of interest and someone they just want to speak to at this point. Meanwhile, Crump and Baker are back on the farm where they had been working previously as casual labourers, continuing on with their work as if nothing had ever happened. It's not long, however, before the pair get a hankering to commit some more crimes together. On November the 13th, Kevin Crump and Alan Baker decide to go on another road trip together, this time to New South Wales Hunter Valley to commit burglary on a home they're familiar with from previous casual work. However, during the attempted burglary, the pair realise that their stolen vehicle has been recognised and attempt to flee the scene. The stolen vehicle had actually been originally stolen from this area by Kevin Crump, so it was rather foolish to bring the stolen vehicle back to the scene of the crime. Unbeknownst to Crump or Baker, the police had already been called when they were attempting to flee the scene, that is. A police officer responding to the attempted burglary actually spots the pair in their stolen vehicle fleeing the scene. This is when a high-speed chase begins between the criminal pair and police. And at this point, police believe they're just chasing down the pair for a stolen vehicle. Crump and Baker ram the first police officer, running him off the road, but they're soon pursued by a second police vehicle. Crump is driving in this high-speed chase, and Baker's actually shooting at police officers with his rifle from their moving car. Suddenly, Kevin Crump pulls his car over and police pull up next to him. This is when Alan Baker grabs his rifle and aims it at the police officer, shooting him in the forehead. The officer, whose name was Bill Millward, survived, but was seriously injured. He spent 4 days in hospital and was back at work in 12. Millward would later go on to receive the Queen's Commendation Award for brave conduct for his efforts on that day. At this point, more police were called for backup. The chase came to a halt in the suburb of Woodville, where the pair fled from their car when they spotted a roadblock. And as the pair fled into a nearby bush, they continued to shoot with their rifles at police officers. A huge ground and air search quickly began for the incredibly dangerous duo, who luckily didn't manage to injure any other police officers that day. Within 3 hours, Kevin Crump and Alan Baker were arrested, found hiding out in a nearby river, and they were literally in the river water, attempting to hide under some reeds. Police had actually initially missed the pair when they were hiding in the river amongst the reeds. Baker was found unarmed, and shortly after, Crump was found, who put his hands up to surrender. Initially, police were baffled as to why a pair of car thieves would go to such great lengths to escape. But after searching the pair's car, they understood why. In their car, they found items belonging to a man that had recently been found shot dead in his car. His name was Ian James Lamb. I'm just going to sidetrack for a moment to tell you about the killing of Ian Lamb. So on November the 3rd, just 3 days before the abduction of Virginia Morse, both Crump and Baker had shot dead 43-year-old Ian James Lamb. At the time of Virginia's disappearance, police had suspected the two crimes could have been connected. Lamb had actually been in the area looking for seasonal work and was sleeping in his car to save costs on accommodation. Crump and Baker spotted Lamb asleep on the roadside in his car one night and made the split decision to shoot him dead with their rifle. Gun-obsessed Alan Baker approached the vehicle and aimed his rifle at the sleeping Ian Lamb. Lamb, who had his car's window wound down, was actually awoken by Baker before being shot in the jaw. He did die instantly. Crump and Baker searched Lamb's car and took some keys, clothes, and money before moving his body to the passenger side and covering it with blankets. The pair then scoured the crime scene for the spent bullet casing, not wanting to leave any evidence at the crime scene, before they got into Lamb's vehicle and drove it to a more remote location so he would not be found straight away. They then wiped down Lamb's car for any fingerprints. They stole petrol out of his car, and then they just proceeded to walk back to their own car and drive off as if nothing had ever happened. It was a number of days before the body of Ian Lamb was found, and it had been enough days as to where his body had entered into the initial stages of decomposition. Initially, Alan Baker and Kevin Crump were only charged with the death of Ian James Lamb, and no immediate connection is made between them and Virginia Morse. That was until investigators did a background check on the pair's rifles and realised 3 of them had been stolen from the Morses' home on the day Virginia was abducted. Following this discovery, both Crump and Baker were interrogated in relation to the abduction and suspected death of Virginia Morse, police telling them what evidence exactly they had against them. Kevin Crump was the first of the pair to confess, and when Alan Baker was told that his good friend Kevin Crump confessed, he also confessed. But unsurprisingly, the two blamed each other. The day after the pair confessed, they led police to the body of Virginia Morse. The small community of Collarenebri were devastated when they found out what had happened to Virginia, and police were completely horrified when they found out what Virginia had been through in her last 24 hours alive. The small town was particularly horrified at this crime, as it wasn't unusual in their area for men to leave their wives at home alone all day on rural, isolated properties, especially when the kids were at school and the husband was at work all day. It was pretty common and it was considered safe. Up until this point, that is. A memorial was held in the town for Virginia, attended by around 700 people. The pair were both charged with the death of Ian James Lamb, conspiracy to kill Virginia Morse, and maliciously wounding a police officer with intent to prevent lawful apprehension, and shooting at police officers with intent to prevent lawful apprehension. Both men pled guilty to all 4 charges. Kevin Crump, in his police statement, claimed that Alan Baker had forced him to kill Virginia Morse and Ian James Lamb, stating, "I was forced to kill Mrs. Morse by Baker because he wanted me to be in as deep as him. He said he was going to kill me if I didn't. I admit that I was prepared to kidnap Mrs. Morse and even to sleep with her, but once again, as with Mr. Lamb, I did not want to be part of her death. It was a choice of either me or Mrs. Morse. During the trial held at the Supreme Court of New South Wales, the details of Virginia Morse's abduction and death were suppressed due to the graphic nature of what happened to her. They were deemed as too graphic and too disturbing for the general public. It took a jury 45 minutes to find both men guilty on all 4 charges. Both men showed little to no emotion as the verdict was read, and Kevin Crump just stared at the floor and was shuddering. Now, if you've got a keen ear, you would have noticed that none of these 4 charges actually related to the death of Virginia Morse. Only conspiracy to kill Virginia and the death of Ian James Lamb. Despite the fact there was evidence that both Crump and Baker had killed Virginia, it was out of the jurisdiction of the government of New South Wales, meaning Crump and Baker could not be charged with her death. And I'll be honest with you, I have no idea how this works, and it sounds like complete BS to me. The good news is both men were given 55 years in prison each and will likely never be released. The judge stated, "You have outraged all accepted standards of behaviour of men. The description of men ill becomes you. You would be more aptly described as animals, and obscene animals at that. I believe that you should spend the rest of your lives in jail, and there you should die. If ever there was a case where life imprisonment should mean what it says, imprisonment for your whole life, this is it." The pair were actually initially jailed within the same prison, but after a public outcry, the pair were separated. In 1997, a legislation passed in the Parliament of New South Wales, and its purpose was to name 10 individuals who were incarcerated that should never ever be released. Along with Anita Cobby's killers, both Baker and Crump were named. And Baker actually unsuccessfully challenged this legislation. Kevin Crump also tried to appeal this legislation, stating, "I believe the sentence I received is over the limit of what I should have received. I believe I should never have received a life sentence because it was not in the worst category of murder cases." His appeal was denied, thank God. In other words, these two will never ever be released from prison. And if somehow, some way, either of these two are granted parole, I hope the public gives them the same respect and consideration that they gave to Virginia Morse. And that is the end of our case. Thank you so much for listening to Virginia Morse's story. I was quite surprised to see that no one had covered this case before. It's a horrendous one, but it is one that needs to be and should be told. It is really up there with one of Australia's worst crimes, in my opinion, just as bad as the Anita Cobby case, which is a case that just horrendous. Shakes me to my core every time I hear about it or think about it. Anyway, thank you for being here. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, etc. Until next time, guys, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you soon.